In early 1944, thousands of men still wearing the faded uniforms of the German Wehrmacht were deployed directly into the American agricultural heartland. But they weren't locked away in maximum security prisons. Instead, in a staggering paradox, a nation considered a global industrial titan was deliberately handing captured enemy combatants heavy tools and sending them out to work the fields. Highly trained soldiers of the Third Reich were suddenly harvesting crops in the Midwest. It was a dangerous, almost absurd gamble, arming the enemy with farm implements on domestic soil. Why would a superpower take such an unprecedented risk with its own food supply? This was not an accident of geography or a temporary oversight. It was the result of a catastrophic, looming crisis that threatened the very foundation of the Allied war effort. America was hemorrhaging manpower. Millions of rural men had either been drafted into the armed forces or had migrated to the booming wartime industrial centers on the coasts. The farms that were expected to feed not only the United States, but also its sprawling Allied armies overseas, were suddenly running critically short of hands. To prevent a collapse in food production, the government engineered a sprawling, highly regulated network designed to weaponize an unexpected resource. They decided to transform captured veterans of the Africa Corps into a controlled, essential civilian workforce. Washington took an enormous, calculated risk, bringing the war directly to the American home front. They were essentially forcing men who had sworn an oath to Adolf Hitler to sustain the very nation they were actively trying to defeat. This wasn't a handful of isolated prisoners. It was a systemic, nationwide operation that placed thousands of enemy combatants right in the backyards of families whose sons were simultaneously dying overseas fighting the Wehrmacht. It was a massive gamble on domestic security. How did the United States government legally orchestrate this unprecedented mobilization? And how did they prevent this vast network of captive labor from erupting into widespread sabotage and violence across the rural heartland? To understand how Washington arrived at such a desperate gamble, you have to look away from the European theater and stand in the middle of a Midwestern cornfield in the autumn of 1942. The American public was understandably fixated on the Pacific Fleet, the brutal island-hopping campaigns, and the massing of bombers on airstrips in England. But a quieter, deeply dangerous crisis was tearing through the agricultural heartland, threatening to undermine the entire Allied war effort from the inside out. Before the United States even fully mobilized its combat divisions for the invasion of Europe, the rural workforce was already vanishing at a terrifying rate. Between 1940 and 1942, American agriculture bled out over 2 million men. It was a staggering demographic exodus, driven by two massive, competing forces of the war machine. First, the draft boards systematically swept through farming counties, pulling young, able-bodied men out of the fields and into military uniforms. Second, the lure of highly lucrative defense contracts drew hundreds of thousands of farmhands away from the dirt and into the booming, neon-lit industrial centers on the coasts. A man who previously made $1 a day pitching hay or mending fences in Iowa could suddenly make exponentially more money riveting steel plates in a California shipyard or assembling bombers in the Detroit factory. The wartime factories demanded muscle, the military demanded infantry, and both of them ruthlessly, efficiently cannibalized the agricultural sector. Washington had successfully mobilized an industrial army, but in doing so, they had inadvertently hollowed out the very workforce required to feed it. The popular historical memory of World War II often paints America as a fully modernized, unstoppable industrial utopia from the very beginning, an endless assembly line of gleaming machinery that simply overwhelmed the Axis powers through sheer technological superiority. But the reality on the ground, especially in the dirt of the American farm, was far more grueling and primitive. The United States in the early 1940s had not yet achieved the fully mechanized agricultural landscape of the post-war era. While tractors certainly existed and were transforming certain regions, they were far from ubiquitous. In fact, millions of farms across the country still operated exactly as they had in the late 19th century. They relied heavily on the raw pulling power of draft horses, teams of mules, and the punishing, back-breaking physical labor of human beings. When the war ignited, it did not instantly modernize the farm. It actively starved it of resources. The War Production Board, tasked with prioritizing military output, clamped down with iron-fisted rationing. Rubber, steel, aluminum, and fuel were immediately diverted to the production of tanks, ships, and aircraft. Consequently, production quotas for civilian agricultural equipment were slashed to the bone. If a farmer's aging tractor broke a vital component, finding a replacement part became a logistical nightmare of requisition forms and endless waiting. If a rural community desperately needed a new combine harvester to make up for the loss of local men, they were often bluntly told that the required steel was currently flying over Germany. You could not simply replace the missing 2 million farmhands with machines, because the government was fundamentally restricting the production of those machines. The burden of production fell squarely back onto human shoulders. Precisely at the moment, those shoulders were disappearing from the landscape. And the pressure being applied by Washington was crushing. The Department of Agriculture wasn't just asking farmers to maintain normal peacetime production levels. They were demanding historically unprecedented yields. American soil had to feed a booming domestic population working double shifts, supply millions of United States servicemen scattered across multiple global theaters, and sustain the besieged, rationing populations of Great Britain and the Soviet Union through the massive Lend-Lease program. It was a catastrophic mathematical impossibility. Produce exponentially more food to win a global war using a fraction of the historical workforce with strictly limited access to modern technology. Facing the specter of a national food shortage that could literally cripple the Allied war machine, Washington launched a frantic, unprecedented domestic mobilization. They attempted to patch the bleeding holes in the rural economy by tapping into demographics that had never before been viewed as primary agricultural labor. The government aggressively promoted the Women's Land Army, recruiting urban and rural women to step into the grueling physical roles left vacant by departing soldiers. Women who had never operated heavy machinery were suddenly driving tractors, pitching manure, and harvesting thousands of acres of wheat. But the women alone, despite their massive contribution, could not close the gaping labor deficit. The crisis forced the government to look even younger. They organized the Victory Farm Volunteers, effectively pulling teenagers directly out of high schools and deploying them into the fields. Urban kids from Chicago and New York were suddenly tasked with detasseling hybrid corn in the sweltering Midwestern heat, picking apples in the Pacific Northwest, and hauling potatoes until their hands bled. When the youth and the women were still not enough to save the harvests, the United States turned outward. In 1942, Washington signed a landmark bilateral agreement with Mexico, initiating the Bracero program. Special trains rolled across the southern border, bringing tens of thousands of Mexican agricultural laborers into the American West and Midwest on temporary contracts. They took on the most punishing manual labor, working the sprawling sugar beet fields and harvesting fruit, becoming a vital lifeline for desperate commercial growers facing total crop failure. The sheer desperation of the moment even forced a bitter, ironic compromise within the government's own security apparatus. The same administration that had forcibly uprooted Japanese Americans from the West Coast and placed them in remote internment camps suddenly realized it was letting critical agricultural talent go to waste while crops rotted in the dirt just miles away. Driven by the fear of a food collapse, the government granted thousands of Japanese American internees temporary seasonal leave. They were released from behind barbed wire, often under armed guard, to save the sugar beet and potato harvests, simply because the nation could not afford to let the food die in the fields. By the twilight of 1943, the United States had mobilized women, children, foreign migrant workers, and its own incarcerated citizens. They had pulled every conceivable demographic lever, drained every domestic reservoir, and patched the fragile agricultural system together with pure willpower and bureaucratic desperation. And yet, the grim, unyielding reports landing on desks in Washington revealed a terrifying reality. It still wasn't enough. The global demand for calories was accelerating faster than this patchwork labor force could plant and harvest them. A critical tipping point had been reached. To save the harvest, to prevent a food crisis that could halt the war effort, the American government realized the domestic well was completely dry. They were forced to look past their own citizens, past their allies, and look toward the absolute last, most highly controversial pool of human labor remaining on the board. By late summer of 1943, Allied ships returning from the Mediterranean were carrying an unexpected and volatile cargo: tens of thousands of captured veterans from Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps. The initial military strategy was pure containment. Ship these prisoners across the Atlantic, warehouse them safely in the vast interior of the United States, and keep them out of the war. But as the domestic agricultural crisis reached its breaking point, the War Department looked at these sprawling internment camps and made a deeply controversial pivot. In August 1943, the military bypassed mounting public anxiety and officially announced the establishment of dedicated POW labor facilities deep within the Midwestern Farm Belt. The government was going to open the gates and put the Wehrmacht to work.
This was not a reckless, improvised free-for-all. It was a rigid operation, strictly governed by international law. If the United States was going to extract labor from a captive enemy, it had to meticulously adhere to the 1929 Geneva Convention. Washington knew that any violation on American soil would invite immediate, brutal retaliation against American troops held in German stalags. Under the treaty, the military could not compel captured officers to work, and enlisted men could only be assigned to tasks entirely disconnected from military operations. They could not manufacture artillery shells, mine strategic metals, or assemble aircraft. But agriculture, harvesting crops and processing vegetables, fell squarely into the permissible category of maintaining the civilian food supply. The government also faced a strict domestic hurdle. They could not allow this captive workforce to undercut American wages or displace citizens. A rigid certification process was established. Before a single German soldier could be deployed to a commercial field, a local agricultural agent had to legally certify that free civilian labor was definitively, categorically unavailable in that specific county. Only when a community proved its crops were literally about to rot in the dirt could the military authorize the use of prisoner labor. Furthermore, the Geneva Convention mandated fair compensation. A captured German soldier, sweating under the Midwestern sun, earned roughly 80 cents for a full day of labor. To prevent them from accumulating cash that could fund a domestic escape or bribe a guard, they were not paid in United States currency. Instead, they earned specialized canteen chits, printed camp scrip, that could only be spent inside the wire to purchase items like cigarettes, razor blades, or writing paper. It was an audacious framework that forced Washington to accept an unprecedented calculated risk. Military planners were acutely aware they were importing highly trained, ideologically hardened enemy combatants directly into the nation's most vital and vulnerable agricultural arteries. The fear of mass breakouts, coordinated sabotage, and rural panic was justified. Yet the High Command made a cold, mathematical calculation. A crippled national food supply was far more dangerous to the Allied war effort than the threat of escaping prisoners. They consciously chose the localized risk of a POW breakout over the global certainty of a wartime famine. By the spring of 1944, this controversial directive materialized into reality with the activation of the sprawling Camp Algona system in Iowa. The treaties were interpreted, the security protocols were signed, and the transport trains carrying the Africa Corps had arrived in the heartland. But drafting policy in Washington was one thing.
The military now faced an unprecedented logistical nightmare. How do you physically extract an enemy army from behind barbed wire, transport them across thousands of square miles of open farmland every morning, and manage their labor without the system collapsing into violent chaos? The solution to the unprecedented logistical nightmare of deploying a captive enemy workforce was to completely reimagine the concept of a military prison. When the War Department selected Camp Algona, situated in the vast, flat expanse of northern Iowa, they did not design it to be a static, impenetrable fortress. It was never intended to operate like Alcatraz or a high-security federal penitentiary, where inmates simply served out their time behind massive stone walls. Instead, the United States military engineered Algona to function as the nerve center of a highly distributed, intensely dynamic labor network. It was less a traditional prison and more a sprawling, militarized dispatch headquarters. To understand the sheer scale and complexity of this operation, you have to picture the map of the American Midwest not merely as a collection of quiet farming towns, but as a complex grid of logistical nodes. Keeping 3,000 enemy soldiers permanently locked behind a single, massive perimeter fence at the main camp in Algona would have been agriculturally useless. The commercial farms and processing plants that desperately needed their muscle were scattered across thousands of square miles encompassing Iowa, Minnesota, and the Dakotas. The physical distance from the main camp to the collapsing harvests was simply too great for daily truck transport. The military could not afford to waste hours of daylight moving men back and forth. So, the Army adapted to the terrain. They deliberately decentralized the captivity. From the heavily guarded central hub of Algona, the military established dozens of temporary, highly mobile outposts known as branch camps. These were not purpose-built concrete prisons engineered to hold men for years. They were hasty, improvised holding facilities dropped directly into the agricultural hot zones where the labor deficit was most severe. The military acted with ruthless efficiency, commandeering whatever infrastructure was available. They reactivated abandoned civilian conservation corps barracks nestled in state parks. They retrofitted empty high school gymnasiums, took over sprawling county fairgrounds, and pitched rows of heavy canvas military tents on the edges of civilian towns. They quickly erected temporary snow fencing, strung up a few restrictive lines of barbed wire, assigned a skeleton crew of armed military police, and suddenly, a quiet Midwestern farming community had a fully operational prisoner of war camp functioning right in its backyard. This distributed network allowed the military to completely bypass the friction of distance. When a local agricultural extension agent filed emergency paperwork signaling that a specific county was facing an imminent labor collapse, the commanders at Algona didn't have to organize a 100-mile convoy every morning. They simply activated a branch camp a few miles from the threatened fields, loaded the German prisoners onto flatbed trucks at the crack of dawn, and delivered them directly to the dirt. The work waiting for these captured soldiers was not the sleek, fully mechanized, tractor-driven farming of the post-war future. It was punishing, highly synchronized manual labor dictated entirely by the unforgiving biological clock of the harvest. One of the most critical, labor-intensive, and physically demanding tasks assigned to the veterans of the Wehrmacht was the detasseling of hybrid corn. This was a relatively new agricultural science designed to radically increase crop yields to feed the war effort. But it required an agonizingly precise human intervention. During a very narrow, sweltering window in mid-July, the pollen-producing tassels at the very top of specific corn stalks had to be physically snapped off by hand to ensure cross-pollination. If the tassels were removed even a few days too late, the crop was ruined. If they were pulled incorrectly and the stalk was damaged, the plant died. It was a brutal race against the biology of the plant itself. Thousands of German prisoners were marched into the endless, suffocating rows of Midwestern corn to perform this delicate, exhausting work. The physical environment was brutalizing. The summer heat in the Corn Belt routinely pushed past 90 degrees, combined with stifling humidity levels that trapped the stagnant air tightly between the towering green stalks.
The razor-sharp edges of the mature corn leaves sliced straight through standard-issue denim work shirts, leaving the prisoners' arms covered in a painful network of stinging paper cuts, while the muddy, irrigated earth sucked heavily at their boots. These were hardened men who had endured the blistering, arid expanses of the North African desert while fighting under Erwin Rommel. But the claustrophobic, wet, suffocating heat of the American agricultural heartland was a completely different kind of physical torment. Yet, the military guards and the civilian contractors demanded relentless speed. The prisoners had to move rapidly down the endless rows, reaching high above their heads, snapping the tassels, and keeping pace with the shifting agricultural front.
When the corn was secured, the labor demands did not stop. They instantly mutated. The vast logistical network pivoted the workforce from the open fields directly into the factories. As the summer progressed, the massive harvests of peas and sweet corn began arriving at rural commercial canning facilities in overwhelming numbers. These processing plants were the critical bottlenecks of the global food supply chain. A harvested pea begins to lose its sugar content and spoil within hours of being picked. To preserve the millions of calories destined for the troops fighting overseas, the canneries had to operate on relentless 24-hour cycles. German soldiers were thrust directly into the deafening, steam-filled, chaotic environment of the processing lines. They hauled heavy wooden crates of raw produce, operated the steaming industrial pressure cookers, and stacked towering mountains of tin cans, working grueling shifts side by side with local American civilians under the harsh glare of industrial lights. When the harvest temporarily lulled, the prisoners were immediately redirected to the unglamorous maintenance of the rural infrastructure. They dug miles of irrigation ditches by hand, repaired broken agricultural machinery, and stretched heavy rolls of barbed wire to mend cattle fencing. The labor was completely fluid, shifting week by week, depending entirely on where the next agricultural emergency flared up. To fully grasp the bizarre, unprecedented reality of this massive domestic operation, you have to look at the American heartland through the eyes of the captured enemy. The men of the Africa Corps did not arrive in the United States as neutral, unbiased observers. They were elite, highly disciplined combat veterans who had been deeply indoctrinated by years of relentless Axis propaganda. Joseph Goebbels' ministry in Berlin had systematically painted the United States as a degenerate, chaotic, racially divided, and fundamentally weak democracy, utterly incapable of sustaining a protracted, industrialized global war. Many of these German soldiers stepped off the transport trains in the Midwest, fully expecting to find a nation crippled by severe domestic shortages, disorganized by political infighting, and teetering on the edge of economic collapse. They sincerely believed the American entry into the war was a geopolitical bluff backed by a fragile paper tiger economy that would soon crumble. But the grueling, daily reality of the Midwestern harvest began to systematically and violently dismantle their ideological conditioning. The true psychological defeat of these German soldiers did not happen under a massive artillery barrage in the deserts of Tunisia. It happened slowly, day by day, in the endless cornfields and the deafening canneries of the American Midwest. Every single morning, they were forced to confront the staggering, terrifying scale of American agricultural and industrial production. They saw endless convoys of transport trucks, perhaps not all brand new, but functional, fueled, and ubiquitous, moving absolute oceans of grain across the state. They witnessed heavy freight trains stretching for miles along the horizon, loaded entirely with food destined for the coasts. They stood inside rural canning factories that effortlessly processed more vegetables in a single week than entire German agricultural regions produced in a full season. The local American farmers, whom the Nazi propaganda machine had explicitly promised were starving and oppressed by a failing capitalist system, were instead relentlessly demanding higher daily quotas and driving the harvest forward with a brutal, highly organized efficiency. The sheer, overwhelming volume of calories being pulled from the earth and pushed into the logistical pipeline was impossible to reconcile with the narrative of a decadent, failing democracy. The American war machine wasn't an abstract myth. It was a physical, deafening reality surrounding the prisoners on all sides. As they loaded another ton of canned food onto a train, the German prisoners realized with quiet, sinking dread that they were actively, physically fueling the very industrial engine that was currently bombing their homeland into rubble. Their preconceived notions of American weakness were shattered by the relentless rhythm of the conveyor belt and the sheer size of the American harvest. From the perspective of the United States military, however, this profound ideological shock among the prisoners was completely irrelevant. The War Department did not care about the internal emotional state or the political disillusionment of the German soldier. They cared exclusively about maximizing his caloric output and his physical utility. The military planners managing the Camp Algona network viewed these thousands of captive men through a cold, strictly logistical lens. The prisoners were not treated primarily as human beings to be punished for their allegiance to the Third Reich. Instead, they were viewed as a highly fluid, rapidly deployable logistical asset. The military managed this captive human workforce with the exact same ruthless precision and calculation that they applied to stockpiles of high-explosive munitions or reserves of aviation fuel. Human muscle was quantified, tracked, and allocated based purely on extreme operational necessity. The Provost Marshal General's Office, coordinating tightly with local civilian agricultural boards, monitored the fluctuating labor deficits across the Midwest on a daily, sometimes hourly basis. If a massive, unexpected storm front accelerated the ripening of a critical tomato crop in southern Minnesota, creating an immediate harvesting crisis, the military command reacted with the speed of a tactical battlefield deployment. They treated the POWs as a strategic reserve. If a branch camp in northern Iowa had a temporary surplus of 50 men because their local fields were washed out by rain, and a cannery 100 miles away was facing a critical bottleneck, the military executed a rapid transfer. The bureaucracy behind this was immense. Civilian farmers had to sign rigid government contracts, agreeing to pay the United States Treasury the prevailing civilian wage for the labor, usually around 40 or 50 cents an hour. The government then paid the prisoner his mandated 80 cents a day in canteen scrip, and the Treasury pocketed the massive difference, effectively using the labor of the German army to financially offset the immense cost of housing and feeding them. It was a highly profitable, ruthlessly efficient logistical machine that treated enemy soldiers as human tractors. This absolute fluidity meant that the branch camp network was in a state of perpetual geographic motion. The American military command was essentially tracking the massive wave of the harvest as it rolled geographically across the map from south to north, and they dragged the captive German workforce right along with it. A branch camp might exist in a county fairground for only 3 or 4 weeks to secure the critical pea harvest in that specific district. The moment the last wooden crate was loaded onto an eastbound train, the temporary fences were immediately torn down. The canvas tents were struck, the field kitchens were packed up, and the entire captive population was loaded back onto a convoy of trucks and shifted 50 miles down the highway to intercept the oncoming sweet corn harvest in the next county. It was a frantic, highly coordinated dance of supply and demand, played out on a massive canvas of thousands of square miles of open farmland. The logistical friction of this constant movement was immense and daily. Military trucks broke down on deeply rutted rural dirt roads, delaying the deployment of work details. Civilian agricultural contractors furiously argued with military guards over the pace of the work, demanding the prisoners move faster, while the guards rigidly enforced the rest periods mandated by the Geneva Convention. Security forces struggled to maintain strict protocols while moving exhausted, sweating prisoners between completely unsecured, sprawling civilian farms. The entire system operated continuously on the very edge of its structural capacity. It was constantly threatened by miscommunications, sudden weather delays, administrative backlogs, and the sheer underlying nightmare of managing a hostile, captive workforce in a wide-open civilian environment.
The United States relied on the sheer vastness of the geography itself as the ultimate prison wall. An escaping German soldier in the middle of Iowa stood out immediately, spoke no English, and was 1,000 miles from any friendly ocean. The logistics of the program were fundamentally sound, but they were stretched incredibly thin. Yet, despite the daily chaos, the localized friction, and the constant geographic movement, the overarching architecture of the program held together. The military had successfully solved the mechanical problem of extracting the enemy from behind the wire and injecting them directly into the failing agricultural arteries of the nation. The supply lines were functioning. The crops were being pulled from the earth before they could rot. But while the War Department in Washington could meticulously control the logistical flow of trucks, the allocation of labor contracts, and the legal parameters of international treaties, they could not dictate the complex, highly volatile human reality playing out on the ground in the heartland. The government had effectively engineered a massive, unprecedented collision between two deeply antagonistic populations. They had delivered the trained soldiers of the Third Reich directly to the American farmer's doorstep. The ultimate survival of this desperate agricultural program no longer depended on military planning or logistical charts. It depended entirely on the volatile psychology of the rural civilian. The system worked on paper, but how does an ordinary American community, a town where the local newspaper prints daily casualty lists from the European theater, and where almost every street has a family hanging a blue or gold star in their front window representing a son bleeding or dying at the hands of the Wehrmacht, actually react when the military orders them to hand heavy steel tools to the enemy? How does a grieving nation function when it is forced to sweat, struggle, and work side by side with the very men who are trying to destroy it? The arrival of the Wehrmacht on the Midwestern farm was not greeted with a sudden, heartwarming wave of wartime reconciliation. The initial reaction across rural communities was a volatile cocktail of deep-seated fury, profound suspicion, and agonizing moral conflict. For the local civilian population, this wasn't an abstract labor policy dictated by bureaucrats in Washington. This was the sudden, physical manifestation of the enemy right in their backyards. When a farmer pulled his truck up to a branch camp to collect his contracted labor detail, he wasn't just picking up anonymous workers. He was looking directly into the faces of men wearing the Afrika Korps insignia, the exact same men who might have fired the artillery shell that injured his neighbor's son, or who belonged to the military machine responsible for the telegram he dreaded receiving. The reluctance to use them was intense. Many local agricultural boards initially balked, furious at the prospect of paying the United States Treasury for the privilege of working alongside the enemy. There were quiet boycotts, heated town hall meetings, and localized strikes by civilian cannery workers who flatly refused to share a processing line with German soldiers. On the other side of the barbed wire, the psychological resistance was equally rigid. The German ranks were not a monolith of broken, compliant prisoners. Among them were hardcore, ideologically driven non-commissioned officers who actively sought to undermine the operation from within. They viewed cooperating with the American agricultural machine as a direct betrayal of the fatherland. There were documented instances of quiet, localized sabotage, a vital gear on a combine harvester mysteriously stripped, a critical irrigation ditch intentionally dug too shallow, or a sudden, synchronized slowdown in the pace of the harvest, explicitly designed to let the crop spoil on the stalk. The tension was a coiled spring threatening to snap the entire program apart. But the sheer, crushing pressure of the harvest forced a brittle, necessary détente. The crops did not care about ideology or grief. If the corn wasn't detasseled, it died. If the peas weren't canned, they rotted. The civilian farmer, facing absolute financial ruin and the collapse of the food supply, desperately needed the muscle. The German prisoner, confined to the crushing monotony of the camp, desperately needed the psychological relief of open space, the physical exertion of work, and the extra 80 cents a day in canteen scrip to buy cigarettes. The structure of the labor contracts forced these two intensely hostile groups into agonizingly close daily proximity.
You cannot work a massive piece of agricultural machinery or manage the chaos of a cannery pressure cooker without communicating. Slowly, grindingly, the abstract, propagandized image of the enemy began to fracture under the weight of shared physical labor. A farmer shouting instructions over the roar of a tractor engine, or a civilian cannery worker handing a heavy crate to a sweating prisoner, began to see the individual instead of the uniform. By the end of the war, the military's official internal assessments revealed a staggering truth. The anticipated waves of mass sabotage and violent uprisings simply never happened. The program held. But the ultimate test of this fragile psychological truce was rapidly approaching. A moment was coming where a massive, unexpected failure in the American logistical system would force a rural community to rely entirely, desperately, on the captured soldiers of the Third Reich to save the harvest. That moment arrived with brutal suddenness in the early summer of 1945 across the sprawling, fertile expanse of southern Minnesota. A volatile combination of heavy spring rains, followed immediately by an intense, prolonged heat wave, had created a localized agricultural emergency. A massive, record-breaking crop of peas, thousands upon thousands of acres stretching toward the horizon, began to rapidly ripen, all at the exact same time. Peas are a notoriously unforgiving crop. Unlike corn or potatoes, which can wait for days in the field, peas operate on a ruthless, microscopic biological clock. The moment they reach peak maturity, the sugar inside the pod begins converting to starch. The growers had an agonizingly narrow window of roughly 48 to 72 hours to get the crop off the vine, shelled, and sealed inside the canneries. If they missed that critical window, the entire harvest would sour, hardening into useless organic waste right in the dirt. But as the massive crop peaked, the local agricultural boards looked at their labor ledgers and realized they were facing total, undeniable collapse. The civilian labor pool wasn't just depleted, it had completely evaporated. The teenagers had already been pushed to their physical limits. The temporary migrant contracts were exhausted elsewhere, and every able-bodied local man was either still deployed overseas or already working double shifts to keep the processing machinery running. The domestic logistical system simply had no more reserves to deploy. Millions of pounds of highly perishable, desperately needed combat rations were hours away from catastrophic failure. The civilian authorities frantically contacted the military command at Camp Algona, triggering what essentially became a massive tactical deployment against nature itself. Recognizing the severity of the threat to the regional food supply, the Army moved with the synchronized speed of a battlefield operation. Over the course of just a few days, military planners aggressively pushed more than 2,400 German prisoners of war out of the central hub and scattered them across 7 rapidly constructed branch camps positioned directly on the front lines of the Minnesota crisis. It was a surgical, desperate insertion of captive muscle. Convoys of army trucks roared down rural dirt roads, delivering the veterans of the Wehrmacht straight into the fields in the sweltering, deafening canneries. For weeks, the region operated in a state of sustained, frantic overdrive. German soldiers worked punishing manual shifts under the blistering Midwestern sun, tearing the vines from the earth, and then took over the grueling night shifts inside the processing plants, operating the massive pressure cookers and stacking tin under the blinding glare of industrial floodlights. The hostility, the suspicion, and the ideological hatreds of the previous years were temporarily swallowed whole by the sheer, desperate mechanical rhythm of the harvest. There was no time for sabotage and no energy for resistance. There was only the relentless, deafening roar of the canning machines, keeping pace with the dying crops. It was a race against biological time, and the captured enemy won it for America. When the final production tallies were calculated at the end of the season, the military commanders at Camp Algona documented a staggering logistical victory. Their internal reports confirmed that without the rapid, precise deployment of those 2,400 captive German soldiers, an estimated 2,594,150 cases of canned peas
would have rotted in the Minnesota soil. The military had successfully engineered the salvation of a critical regional food supply. But as the final heavy crates of rations were loaded onto rail cars heading toward the coasts, the true gravity of what had just occurred in those fields began to crystallize. The massive, synchronized operation in southern Minnesota was no longer just an isolated, desperate local success. It was the undeniable proof of concept for a staggering national machine, one that was quietly reshaping the entire American war effort.
To understand the true scale of what that national machine accomplished, you have to look at the impossible math of the American home front. By the end of the conflict, the rural workforce had suffered a devastating demographic collapse, shrinking by approximately 6 million people. Under normal circumstances, a hemorrhage of that magnitude should have triggered a catastrophic famine, crippling the Allied supply lines. Yet, defying all conventional logic, American wartime food production miraculously soared, ultimately peaking at 32% above pre-war levels. The popular myth often credits this impossible surplus entirely to the American tractor, to the automated machinery that supposedly replaced every missing man. But machines alone did not save the harvest. The true victory belonged to a sprawling, ruthless system of human redistribution. And into that system, the United States plugged its own enemies. Out of more than 425,000 prisoners of war held on American soil, up to 265,000 were actively deployed to cover critical civilian labor deficits. Official military records confirm that between 1943 and 1945, these captive soldiers contributed more than 34 million man-days of contract work. Over 20 million of those man-days were poured directly into the dirt, making agriculture the absolute largest category of prisoner labor during the war. This reveals a profound, staggering irony. The Third Reich actually lost these men twice. Germany lost the veteran soldier first when he surrendered in North Africa or Europe, permanently removed from the Wehrmacht's order of battle. But they lost him a second time when his physical muscle, endurance, and time were captured, reorganized, and actively weaponized as a productive resource by the enemy. While you cannot draw a direct line from a specific bushel of Iowa corn to an American infantryman storming the beaches of Normandy, the macroeconomic impact was absolute. Captive labor kept the domestic food supply from buckling. It sustained the civilian workforce, building the heavy bombers, and, crucially, it freed up American men to cross the Atlantic rather than staying home to harvest wheat. The United States absorbed a paralyzing crisis, turning a manpower deficit into a logistical triumph, and solving it by forcing the enemy's own soldiers to quietly build the foundation of their empire's defeat. The United States won this logistical war not because it possessed an infinite stockpile of men, but because it possessed the organizational genius to weaponize its own vulnerabilities. When the agricultural system faced absolute collapse, the government didn't just build more tractors, it built a mechanism capable of absorbing a hostile army and converting it into a domestic asset. German soldiers arrived on American shores as proud veterans of the Wehrmacht's early conquests, yet they were instantly fed into a relentless production engine that extracted their muscle to supply the Allied front. The true, terrifying power of the American war machine was its ability to look at a crippling deficit and force its sworn enemies to literally harvest the seeds of their own destruction.